Hey all, in this video we're going to go over market equilibrium and producer and consumer surplus. What type of music is a balloon scared of? Pop music. So market equilibrium. So we already talked about this idea of supply and demand, right? So we have our graph here. On our y-axis, right, is always going to be our price, and on our x-axis is always going to be quantity. We talked about how the demand curve is always going to be downward sloping because there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And we talked about how supply is always going to be upward sloping because there's a positive or direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And so here, right, when we're bringing it all together, that is what market equilibrium is. And so if we just look at our definition of market equilibrium, it's when supply and demand are brought together to determine the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity using the supply schedule and the demand schedule. So this should be really simple, right? So where is our market equilibrium? It's just where supply meets demand. It's that equilibrium point right here. So according to this graph on the right, our equilibrium price is going to be $3 because that's where supply, right, meets demand at $3. Our equilibrium quantity is 30 units of whatever good this may be because, right, yet again, that's where supply meets demand. And so here, right, at $4 here, there's a disequilibrium. So why is there a disequilibrium? Well, we already know, right, at $3, right, that is the equilibrium price and that is the equilibrium quantity. But let's say this firm decides to sell at $4. Well, all of a sudden, we're not at the point where supply meets demand. Instead, right, let's use a different color here. Let's use green, right? This right here is our quantity demanded. This right here is our quantity supplied, right? So at $4 here, our quantity demanded is 10 units. But the producers are supplying 50 units at $4. So we're going to say that our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity demanded. Or we could say quantity demanded is less than our quantity supplied. They both mean the same thing. And so when we have more supply than demand, right, that is going to give us a surplus of goods. And so if we look at this question, right, how much is a surplus at $4? Well, at $4, right, the quantity demanded is 10 units. The quantity supplied is 50 units, so our surplus has to be 40 units of whatever good this may be, right? Just 50 minus 10. Well, the opposite is true, right? We still know, according to this graph, right, our equilibrium price is $3. Our equilibrium quantity, let's just say it's still 30. So let's say now all of a sudden the price is at $2. Well, yet again, we're not at equilibrium. So let's use red to calculate this out. So here, right, our quantity supplied is 20. Notice it's different from our past one, right? It's not quantity demanded on the left-hand side. The reason why it's quantity supplied, right, is because we're on the supply curve right now. And so at $2, right, our quantity demanded, right, is 40 units, right? So our quantity supplied is 20, our quantity demanded is 40. So here we're going to say, right, that our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied. Or we can say our quantity supplied is less than our quantity demanded. They both mean the same thing. And so when our demand is greater than our supply, we're going to say that that gives us a shortage of goods. And so if we look at this question, right, how much is the shortage at $2? Well, here at $2, right, our quantity supplied is 20, our quantity demanded is 40. So the shortage is 20 units, or we just do 40 minus 20 to get to that 20 unit mark. And so if we do a little practice, right, well then if we look at $1, how much is the shortage if the price is at $1? So pause the video real quick and then figure it out yourself so we can go over it. All right, so here, right, according to this graph, right, at $1, our quantity supplied is 5 units. At $1, our quantity demanded is at 25 units. So how much is the shortage? Well, here we know that our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supply, so yet again, it has to equal a shortage, right? Yet again, because it tells us in this question. So here, right, we take our quantity demanded subtract it from our quantity supplied. So our shortage is 20 units. So here, the reason why we talk about the shortage and surplus with market equilibrium is if we go back to Unit 1, we talked about this idea of the invisible hand. We're going to say that the free market system automatically pushes the price towards the equilibrium, right? So if we have a surplus like we do up here, right, when our quantity demanded, right, and then we have our quantity supplied, right? Our quantity demanded is less than our quantity supplied here. So producers are supplying more than what consumers are demanding. So up here, right, is our surplus. Well, here, right, what are producers going to do if prices are too high? Well, they are just going to push prices down to get us to that $3 equilibrium, right? So they could sell more goods. Well, what happens when there's a shortage? Right? What happens when our quantity supplied, right, is less than our quantity demanded, right? Which at this point is going to be a shortage. Well, here, what are producers going to do? Well, producers are going to push up their price, right, to get us back to equilibrium. And this is what happens in a truly free market system, right? But yet again, there's no country in the world that has a truly free market system. So every single country at some level has government intervention. But in a truly free market system, there is no need for government intervention because producers are just going to raise or lower the price to get rid of the surplus or shortage. Of course, life isn't as perfect as this theory right here, but this is theoretically how it works. And so the last thing that we're going to go over is consumer and producer surplus. So consumer surplus is just the difference in what you are willing to pay. Oops, 1 second. Let's erase that real quick. It's the difference in what you are willing to pay and what you actually pay, right? So our equation here is just going to be the buyer's maximum minus the price. For example, right, let's say I head into a car dealership. And for me, the maximum amount that I'm willing to pay for a car is, let's say, $10,000, right? If it's $10,001, I'm not going to buy it because that is my maximum price I'm willing to go up to. But let's say, right, the actual price of the car is $5,000. Well, what is my consumer surplus? Well, my consumer surplus is going to be my buyer's max, the highest amount I'm willing to go, which is $10,000, minus the actual price I paid for the car, which is $5,000, right? So here, our consumer surplus is $5,000. The difference between what I'm willing to pay, the max amount I'm willing to pay, minus the price that I actually pay. Well, then we get to producer surplus. Well, producer surplus is basically the same thing as consumer surplus. It's the price the seller received minus, right, how low they're willing to sell it for, right? So in other words, it's just price minus the seller's minimum. So let's look at this car example again, right? So obviously in our last example, we said the car sold for $5,000. But let's say, right, the seller was willing to go as low as $1,000, right? So in other words, my maximum price was $10,000. The seller was willing to sell this car at $1,000, meaning if the car was sold at if I offered a price of $999, the seller wouldn't take it because the lowest that seller is willing to go is going to be $1,000. So here, our producer surplus is $4,000, right? The $5,000 price minus the $1,000 the seller would have, the lowest possible price the seller would have sold this, right? And so here, what's more important for us is you need to know how to calculate it. That's why we just went over it. But what's also important for us is, well, where is it on the graph, right? So this is our supply, this is our demand, right? And this is our quantity equilibrium, and this is our price equilibrium. So our consumer surplus, remember, it's the price, it's the buyer's maximum minus the price. And so if we look at this graph right now, we know what the price is. The price is the equilibrium price, right? Where supply meets demand, right here. So here, where our producer surplus is anything above equilibrium, right? But below the demand curve, right? So anything above equilibrium, but below the demand curve right there. Why? Well, here, right? This person up top here, right, is willing to purchase good at this price point, but they're actually paying the equilibrium price. This person, oops, 1 second. Let's redo that, right? Oops, what's going on? There we go. Right? So this person, this person right here, right, is willing to pay that price, but is going to pay the equilibrium price, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's why that is producer surplus. Well, producer surplus. Well, producer surplus, remember, is just the price minus the seller's minimum. So it's anything in blue right here, right? So this right here is producer surplus. This right here is consumer surplus. And so why is the blue producer surplus? Well, remember, it's the price minus the seller's minimum. Well, here, this price, yes, it represents the price that consumers are paying, but the equilibrium price also represents the price that producers are receiving for selling that good. And so with this hypothetical thing, there are some sellers that are willing to sell their good at this low price, but they're actually going to sell it at the equilibrium price up here. There are some sellers that are willing to sell this good at this price right here, but yet again, they're selling it at that equilibrium price, and so on and so on and so on. So in other words, producer surplus is anything below equilibrium and above our supply curve. And so a better drawn out graph is this right here. This is our consumer and our producer surplus. Well, here, one thing that College Board likes to do to you guys is to ask you guys to calculate each one of the following. Well, here, remember, to calculate it, you need to take the area of the consumer and the area of the producer surplus. Well, it just so happens in this example, right, that these are triangles. And so here, to calculate the area of a triangle, remember, it's just 1/2 base times height. And so here, right, if our consumer surplus is at $20, right, so that's that equilibrium price right here. So it's at $20. Well, what is our consumer surplus? Let's do this in red. Well, our consumer surplus, remember, is just 1/2 base times height. Well, here, we already know it's just 1/2. So what's our base? Well, our base is from 0 all the way out to our equilibrium quantity, which is 30, right? Our height is then $35 to $20, right? We're not going to go all the way down to 0, right? Because remember, the equilibrium price is at $20 here. So our height is just 35 minus 20, which is $15, right? So in other words, you can do the math. So it's just essentially 15 times 15, which off the top of my head, I don't necessarily know, right? Mainly because this is pretty early in the day, which equals $225. So in other words, the area of the consumer surplus is $225. Right? And then you're going to do the same thing for producer surplus. Well, let's look at question number 3 then. What is the total surplus? Well, our total surplus, let's do this in blue, right, is just going to be our consumer surplus plus our producer surplus. So both the consumer and producer surplus added together is going to get us to our total surplus there. So the last thing that I wanted to go over is, well, what happens if there's a surplus or a shortage? What happens if the sellers don't sell right at that equilibrium price? In other words, what happens if sellers don't sell at this $20 mark? What happens if there are only 10 units produced, meaning that there is a shortage of goods? Well, here, that's what we get something called dead weight loss. And you don't necessarily need to understand it right now. All you need to know right now is that dead weight loss is when we don't maximize our consumer and producer surplus. When there is a shortage or when there is a surplus of goods, there's always going to be something called dead weight loss, which another word for dead weight loss is going to be inefficiency. So if something is inefficient, right, there is going to be dead weight loss shown on our graph. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.